Dr. David Martin, is the architect and founder of the Global Innovation Commons. Dr. Martin recently posted a video which has gone tremendously viral, stating an official allegation of violations of the US Constitutions and civil and criminal acts pertaining to the COVID-19 fear tactics. Dr. David Martin, a very, very warm welcome to you, sir.
And I'd like to do something that is, I think, part of decorum, and that is to read into the record a couple of documents which are exceptionally important and unfortunately are preserved in ways that are almost inaccessible to the public. But if one wants to truly pursue the facts that lead to what we currently call what I call COVID-19 branded campaign, it's important to read the record that begins with 2001. And most of you will be shocked when I say 2001 because we were told that SARS started in 2002. But the federal funding for coronavirus, chimeric and genetically modified organism mutations and amplifications started in 2001. And the official start of that started with a series of grant numbers that I'm going to read into the record so that anyone who wants to do fact checking can go back and not only look at the information, but unfortunately, if you read these grants, you find that most of what we've been told lately is in fact categorically false. You will see in each one of these grants data that supports the fact that since 2001, there's been an active campaign to try to take a naturally occurring substrate of what is considered to be a strand of RNA and modify it and amplify it for the purpose of increasing its virulence. Those grants include grant GM 63228 and A123946, two grants that resulted in the issuance of United States Patent 7279327. That patent was specifically the direct outcome of the work done under the grants starting in 2001, which was specifically done to produce an infectious strain of coronavirus explicitly. That is what the research was for. That is what the research did. And the resulting patent held by the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, was in fact a patent derived from work done to effectively, to use terms that are consistent with the work of this tribunal, weaponize the biosphere. Very recently, just anecdotally, before I go further, I want to also make an observation about the fact, and I'm going to come to this a bit later, but I want to read something that just came to my attention today. The statement made by an official commenting in the journal Nature said, the debate comes down to how informative the results are. The only impact of this work is the creation in a lab of a new non-natural risk. That is a quote. That's not my quote. That's not somebody else's. That is published in the journal Nature from Richard Ebright, a molecular biologist and biodefense expert at Rutgers University. So, setting the stage for this, I think it's important to understand that the very nature of the human interaction with what we call coronavirus began in federally funded research by the United States in 2001 and specifically sought to amplify and weaponize a naturally occurring protein strain that was amplified through the RNA associated with coronavirus. That's 2001. Additional grants that took place before any of us have been conducting thoughts or inquiries in the main were grants AI-0185524, grant AI0157157, grant AI0107810, and 2 U19 and U54 grants, resulting in patents including patent 7618802 and patent application 2016-0238601. Now, the reason I'm entering these documents into the official record is for a very important reason. This information contains the evidence that says that infections in humans resulting from or contributed by coronavirus are not only commonly known and well documented, but specifically the mechanisms whereby the coronavirus reportedly interacts with the human cell were mechanisms not only identified, but specifically amplified over not only moral and ethical obligations of the fact that this represented a non-natural risk, to quote the gentleman from Rutgers, but more problematically, it represented a situation where there was an alliance that was being formed, where the mutation of a coronavirus became an economic incentive for very specific organizations to work in collaboration. And this is where I'm going to take us on a journey, starting with the illegal patents filed in 2003 by the Center for Disease Control and by the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, both who sought to and ultimately received patents specifically identifying strands of nature in violation of 35 U.S. Code Section 101. Pursuing and receiving a patent on nature is illegal. Under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 of the United States Constitution and its international equivalents, inventors are entitled to access proprietary rights and patents, or copyrights, on things that are in fact works directly derived from their creative input, and they are explicitly prohibited under every law from patenting nature. Nature is not to be patented. It cannot be patented. But despite the absence of all moral supervision at the United States Patent Office and at international patent organizations, both the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill and the Center for Disease Control, a part of the Department of Health and Human Services, procured and obtained patents on nature, and then did something more insidious, and that is they patented the means by which you could detect the presence of coronavirus in a sample. Now, what does this mean? What this means is effective in 2003, the public would have had to infringe on illegal patent rights granted to the Center for Disease Control and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill to confirm or deny any allegation of any statement about any coronavirus from 2003 forward. By effectively controlling the means of detection, by prohibiting anyone else from doing independent verification, the foundation cornerstone of the conspiracy was laid in 2003. Subsequent to 2003, a number of organizations acting in violation of 15 U.S. Code, which is the antitrust laws of the United States, and their international equivalents, selectively identified and selectively obtained relationships that conveyed economic benefit preferentially among the co-conspirators. Rather than being an open and free and open society question of saying, A, is coronavirus something we should concern ourselves with? B, is there a way for us to detect and mitigate it? A small group of individuals elected to control and remove the option from the public of independent inquiry into the coronavirus and its potential pathogenicity. What makes this particularly problematic is the fact that that collusion was done using US taxpayer and international foundation and corporate sponsored research in excess of $485 million between the period of 2003 and 2013. Now, I'm going to leave for this particular inquiry the fact that several of the things I'm going to reference are in the public record. For example, I'm not going to recite every one of the components of the allegations that I have made in my previous videos, but I will highlight a few things. First, the Center for Disease Control, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, the P3 program funded by DARPA, which included Vanderbilt, Emory University, and the Wuhan Institute of Virology, have for many years been continuing their research into not only the identification and detection of coronavirus, but have specifically been working on amplification of the spike protein and on the receptor binding domain regions, which are the interaction sites between the virus and the human cell. They have been doing it specifically to amplify the pathogenicity. Now, the argument being made by them, in fairness, I try to be as level and fair as possible, is that there has been some inquiry into the degree to which the coronavirus could ultimately be used as a vector to deliver some form of therapeutic agent. So the idea is that you could use nature, potentially, as a means by which you could infect into people some other therapeutic agent. Setting aside the moral and ethical questions associated with mutating nature to deliver agents that may be both therapeutic and may be toxic, setting aside the moral argument for a moment, which I have a hard time doing, but setting it aside, there is in fact a scientific inquiry into whether or not modifying these particular viruses might have a therapeutic use as a mechanical device to infect some other agent into the cell. Now, that's giving them the benefit of the doubt. The fact that they have specifically focused on the spike protein and the ACE2 receptor, and the ACE2 receptor is very important because the angiotensin converting enzyme receptor, which is prevalent in the lungs and prevalent primarily in the kidneys, are two locations where we know that high degrees of interchange of other body fluids and other cell matrices actually come into contact with one another, which means that if you can find ways to amplify the infectivity of a particular virus or strain of viruses, you have the ability to, both for good or for ill, significantly alter the way in which the human body is made to respond to the natural occurrence of pathogens in the ecosystem. We have an immune system that is made to understand the types of information contained in the RNA of viruses. That's part of who we are. That's part of our evolutionary makeup. Part of what gives us an immune system is the fact that we have the ability to encounter and to process through exposure to a number of pathogens. That's part of who we are. That's part of our makeup. But when we modify and specifically engineer aberrant forms of both proteins on the outside shell of a virus, as well as the receptor binding domains, we are playing with something that the human body is not prepared to deal with. The human body was never prepared to deal with engineered viruses. It was never prepared to deal with, as I quoted from Rutgers, a non-natural risk. Now, I'm not being a fearmonger. I'm merely reporting an important fact that says that the suggestion that science, left to 2 or 3 individuals on this planet, has thoughtfully considered the moral, social, and biologic implications of building super viruses is beyond the pale. And we as a society cannot stand for this type of recklessness. In 2013, that wasn't my opinion. In 2013, and I encourage people to look for this, it's very difficult to find. I'm holding in my hand the actual letter that was sent from the Department of Health and Human Services and the National Institutes of Health to every single researcher conducting chimeric research. On October the 21st, 2014, after the National Institutes of Health had determined that their concerns were that chimeric viral research was potentially breaching ethical and moral limits that had been unconsidered. The letter that was sent said that the United States government had announced that it was going to limit or prohibit what was called gain of function research. The actual letter sent to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill contains, unfortunately, the following paragraph, which I will read into the record. As your grant is currently funded, this pause is voluntary. Did you hear what I just said? We've determined that what you're doing is potentially unethical. We know that the patents resulting in this are in fact illegal and violate the not only 35 U.S. Code Section 101, which outlaws the patenting of nature, but overrides the Supreme Court determination in Myriad Genomics in 2013, which explicitly stated and confirmed that viral or any other DNA patents of nature were illegal and not allowed to be pursued. This letter sent from the Department of Health and Human Services from the National Institutes of Health states, not only is your grant currently funded, the pause is voluntary, organizations conducting gain-of-function research supported by the NIH have an opportunity to transition the applicable research to research that is not covered by the funding pause, halt the applicable gain-of-function research until the outcome of deliberative process is known, or continue to conduct the applicable gain-of-function research until the current ended period. Now, what makes that a problem? Beyond all of it, what makes that a problem is that the way in which these grants were funded and remain funded were an evergreen process under what was called the U54 and the R01 program. In other words, we had a public statement that was a public statement to be the fig leaf behind which we hid when we questioned the morals and ethics of doing this type of research. But rather than actually standing for those morals and ethics, rather than backing the public's concern that said that this was unethical and potentially illegal, the researchers, as long as they had a preserved economic interest, were allowed to continue violating the moral and ethical standards in 2013 and 2014. Now, not surprisingly, coming out of those funded research programs were the mutations specifically linked to the bat coronavirus, which not surprisingly was going to come into feature in the latter part of 2019. Every single one of the research disclosures from 2014 and following, from the labs associated with the gain-of-function research, specifically used as their model and their prototype and referent the bat coronaviruses that have somewhere between 90 and 96% homology to what is being called SARS-CoV-2. And here's where I'm going to get very precise from a scientific standpoint. Well, the phylogeny of the coronavirus that is associated with what is called SARS-CoV-2 allegedly has some degree, depending on who you're reading, somewhere between 200 and 300 mutations from the previous clade of coronaviruses. What we know is that no scientist has the ability, nor have they undertaken the question of whether or not any of the mutations are material. We do not have, in any scientific publication, in any independent inquiry, and in any inquiry not associated with a propaganda campaign of summarizing literature reviews, we have no evidence that SARS-CoV-2 has any unique pathogenicity. What we do know is that there are certain mutations, but we also know that within SARS-CoV-2, since January, there have been 229 documented mutations, meaning that the notion that somehow or another, that somewhere in December or January, a new virus emerged is patently false. There is not a single piece of evidence to suggest that a new virus exists. What is very clear is that there, in fact, are a multitude of viruses. To be specific, there are 39 identified that have the genetic makeup associated with what we call the SARS coronavirus, which is just the sudden acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus, that virus that has the ACE2 and the spike protein that create a pneumonia-like symptom. Now, let's go into the more present moment just to get ourselves grounded. In February, Dr. Anthony Fauci of the National Institute of Asthma and Infectious Diseases, Allergies and Infectious Diseases, Dr. Anthony Fauci and Ralph Baric, the two individuals I've identified as co-conspirators since 2003, who have maintained the control over both the coronavirus and its detection and potential therapeutic implementation. The two of them lamented in an article that was reported in Stat that funding for coronavirus research was unfortunately unreliable because it ebbed and flowed with outbreaks. Now, that seems like an innocent thing to say, right? That it's a shame that, people get interested in coronaviruses and then they don't, and then they get interested and then they don't. The reason why that particular article is so problematic is during the period of time that that article was being written and published, Dr. Baric sat on the committee, the International Committee for Taxonomy of Viruses. And he was on the committee that determined, number one, that this was a novel coronavirus. Number two, that based on one study, only one study published in China, which hypothecated the potential virulence with no evidence of what was going on in China, came to the conclusion that violated the ICTV existing protocol by stating that we were going to manufacture both a novel virus designation as well as a novel disease recommendation. To put that into context, when the Middle East respiratory syndrome broke out, MERS, as we've been told to call it, broke out in 2012. It took from the discovery of the virus that was associated in all likelihood with camels. It took from the discovery of the virus infecting humans in 2012 in Egypt. That same committee, 3 years to conclude that the virus was unique and novel, and to conclude that there was a proper name for that condition. That same committee, who desperately pleaded with the public to justify pouring more money, not only into their research, but more problematically into the pharmaceutical interventions that they were directly participating in which they had material benefit, they decided that it was important that we both name the virus and name a disease. What makes this problematic is a very simple fact. They named a thing that did not exist and could not be independently verified. There was no means by which, outside of the conspirators, there was no means by which independent testing could be done. That is because they controlled the means of testing. Furthermore, the testing that they reportedly did could not distinguish between every strain of coronavirus. They've made no allegation that they can, and there is no evidence that they can. And when it turned out that what was considered to be atypical pneumonias were increasing in prevalence throughout the winter months in the Northern Hemisphere. A tragic decision was made which ultimately indicts this entire exercise as a complete fraud and crime against humanity. Because what was decided was that for the first time in any of these outbreaks, the determination was made that no test confirming the presence of the virus would be required to state that someone in fact had either acquired or had resident or suffered from or died of the actual virus. COVID-19, the brand, was meant to embrace not only people tested with the virus, but COVID-19, the brand, was meant to embrace anyone presenting an idiopathic pneumonia, fever, or any other symptom. Now, I'm not going out on a limb to suggest that the record keeping at the Center for Disease Control had a pornographic obsession with trying to run up the numbers to terrorize the population. Because it turns out that if you only looked at patients that had positive tests for the presence of the virus and presented clinical symptoms, somewhere between a half and a quarter of what was reported would have been even included in the clinical population. And if we look at the actual comorbidity data that is coming out, we see that the likelihood that the virus actually was proximate cause of death to anyone is probably somewhere between 5 and 10% in the most aggressive scenario. Meaning that this entire campaign of terror was created specifically for the purpose of reinforcing the financial interests and the direct economic gain of the co-conspiring parties. It was directly benefiting a series of pharmaceutical companies and vaccine manufacturers, most notably, by the way, Gilead Sciences and Sanofi, the two companies that hold the most proprietary control over vaccines and therapies to treat coronavirus infection. Those two organizations not only benefited richly and were enriched by this declaration, but unfortunately, both organizations cannot extract themselves from the fact that they are in fact inextricably linked with the very individuals and organizations that declared this to be a pandemic in the first place. So we have an economic interest creating the outbreak. We have an economic interest creating the fear and pandemic. And we have an economic interest that is diverting public funds to their own economic self-interest to go into therapies that we know have been around for a long time. Remember Gilead Sciences remdesivir, which Anthony Fauci, after mysteriously Gilead Sciences nearly doubled its lobbying budget in the first quarter of 2020, mysteriously remdesivir became the agent of preference, despite the fact that there was no evidence that this was preferential to any previous documented treatments, including the August 2005 publication of the fact that chloroquine was perfectly fine in terms of treating previous coronavirus outbreaks. Despite all of the evidence, no effort was made to independently verify the independence of any of these things. And at the end of every scientific publication, from January until the present, each author has stated unequivocally that they have no financial interest in the research and the positions that they're taking. That is a patent lie, evidence in every one of the documents I've presented. And with that, I'm going to rest, and I'll look forward to your questions.